Hello, everybody. This is John Felt. Welcome to the NCGA FMC Ag Weather Outlook for February 27th, 2016. If you're like me, by the time you get to the end of February, you're sure ready for spring to get around. And I'm really looking closely for any sign of a major change one way or the other. So I'll be talking about that, really focusing on spring now, both in this briefing and then things I'll be sending out this week. So the past 7 days, here we go. We definitely had quite a bit of a winter storm over parts of the Great Lakes region. Doesn't look all that impressive in this past precipitation over the 7 day period, but that was in the form of snow. So that green area in Michigan, that was over a half inch of liquid precipitation, or at least around that, and that came in the form of snow. The eastern Corn Belt, Southern Illinois and Indiana, quite a bit of precipitation, 2 inches. And the rest of the area, the central and upper Midwest, dry. A little bit of snow here and there, but nothing all that significant. Now, speaking of snow, this is that area that I was talking about that really got hit last week. Mainly Michigan, but also right along the Great Lakes here, parts of northwest Indiana and northeast Illinois. So that really got hit. Everywhere else is sort of light snow. Some moderate snow here through Illinois, but that was generally pretty light and melted very quickly. But there is still some snow on the ground from this last band of precipitation that came through. You can see that there from southern Illinois up into Michigan, across parts of Illinois and Indiana. That'll probably be melting fairly soon. I don't see that staying on the ground all that long because we do have relatively mild weather. We did have a bit of extra snow over the area that melted, and that's over northern Iowa, Minnesota border, and that's really typical this time of year. If we do melt snow in February, it's definitely likely that we will get some additional snow later in the season. Good thing, like I mentioned last week, is that 20 inches of snow that was on the ground, we did get that into the rivers and working itself downstream. And you can see much of that's already worked its way downstream. We look at tributaries in Iowa, and the yellow boxes are high within bank flows. Remember last week we had some orange boxes, that was minor flooding, so that's worked its way downstream into the Mississippi River drainage. And if you look at the Mississippi, you don't see any flooding, and that's because it attenuated. The flood wave that was coming down through the high flows, as they got further south, they attenuated. They weren't quite as high, and that's almost perfect what we want this time of year to get that water downstream, working downstream. Now, over the Indiana and Illinois River basins, a bit higher, but still minor flooding. Those are those orange boxes, and again, the more we get that out, at this time of year, the better we are. So that's pretty typical for late winter, early spring to get minor flooding. I would not call that at all unusual. Now, what is a bit unusual, especially compared to the last 2 years, if you're in this region, the Great Lakes, not all that much ice, only 12.9% Great Lakes ice coverage compared to the last couple of years where we were almost all, at least a majority covered, if not almost totally covered. So we're still getting quite a bit of lake effect snow because the lakes have not frozen over. So quite a bit of difference from one year to the next. Now, in my last couple of briefings, I've really been looking at the polar source regions for either cold or warm air. And we've been alternating back and forth. And I think that's the story I want to sort of talk about right now, is that I'm seeing a variability in temperature. We don't see one type of situation, one type of pattern that sets in and is either extremely intense or either stays in there for a long time. This area right in here has been flip-flopping back and forth week to week. Now, this purple here is unusually cold air, and this white here is saying it's intense, but it's not all that widespread. This is mild weather, so we're starting off with quite mild weather this weekend, but when I see this cold air up here, it's just a matter of time before that pushes down. Now, if we look at that transition here, I've showed this a number of times as we've gone through winter, these periods here. I sort of put right now we're in a 5A going into the 6th pattern. Now, 5A is basically saying we're going to have some mild weather. We're seeing this push of the Arctic oscillation a little bit, not positive, but getting back, rising here. And then it sort of stays into sort of a negative, but not all that much. That's sort of the story. And that's going to be through the end of February into the early part of March. So cooler temperatures, or colder temperatures, but not exceedingly so. So this week we have this dip in the jet stream. It's going to provide that gradual cool down. It won't be an early week, but there will be a system moving through that'll mark that transition, and then we'll be getting into that colder air. So the average here, you can see we still average overall above normal because we're going to be starting off with above normal temperatures. And that pattern that we've seen where the western Corn Belt has been mild, eastern Corn Belt has been a bit colder, I think that's generally the pattern we're going to settle into by the end of the week into next week. And there will be a transition with that. Now, this is that system. If you read everything I put out, I mentioned 2 or 3 or 4 days ago that at one time this looked like a very strong system. Right now, it still looks like a modestly strong system, but it does not look like there will be as much cold air. So the snow associated with this will not be nearly as significant that it did look at one time. And right now, it does look like model run to model run is some consistency with that. Now, there will be some snow. I will be talking about that, but it looks like it's going to be relatively limited. There will be also some precipitation, in this case over the eastern Corn Belt. We're recharging soils in that area. Sort of interesting to see also, make a note here that El Nino, we're totally reversed in many cases of what you would expect. This is an area you'd expect to be relatively dry, but we are recharging. We do need some more precipitation over the upper Midwest, and I don't see that at all this week. It looks very quiet over the Dakotas, Minnesota. There'll be some precipitation in the middle Corn Belt, but most likely averaging below normal for the week. Now, the snowfall forecast, I think there's a lot of variability on these light to moderate events. Right now, you can see it's sort of from eastern Missouri, parts of Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio, light amounts elsewhere. I would not get locked into that. It could be a little bit further north, but it does look like there'll be what I would say a 1 to 3 inch snow with that transition to the colder air later this week. Not a big snow event, but there could be some spots here and there. There could be some significant problems if you get into that 3 to 4 inch range. Again, it's very unlikely to say exactly where that'll be. Then we still have, here we go, we're still talking about the lake effect snows here due to the unfrozen water. Okay, now when we get into the March 3rd through the 8th time frame, it gets sort of interesting. Right now, this looks like the pattern that we've seen on and off for quite some time. The ridge in the west, the bulging north of the jet stream in the west, the dip in the east, and that's going to break the temperatures down right here. Now, this is if I had to pick one picture image that represents this winter, this would be it. Cooler than normal weather over the east, milder than normal weather over the west. That's really been the story so far. That looks like in that 6 to 10 day period, that's going to be the story. Now, we get beyond that, and it gets sort of interesting here. The models right now are showing a very significant warm-up towards the period March 8th through 13th. And matter of fact, temperature anomalies right now over even the central Corn Belt are getting way up there, 10 to 15 degrees above normal. I looked out beyond this, and you would think, I was looking at, well, this is that time where we got a really significant break into the spring period, but right now I would not be confident to say that because I looked out beyond this and it looks like another push of cold air. So I think the story here is a variability going back and forth between a anomaly of warm and then getting cooler, not exceedingly so, and then going back to warm. So a real variability heading into the end of February and into the first half of March. Now, precipitation, there will be some here and there, but I do not see any real strong positive precipitation anomalies. I think generally the eastern Corn Belt is looking like it could be above normal a bit, but the upper Midwest in this region right here still looks quite dry. I don't see anything significant in that region. Week 2 looks like it definitely could be some wet weather down into the south central U.S. So the alerts this week, let's just keep an eye on where that band of heavy snow will be. It's really more moderate snow. There could be just a couple pockets of heavy. I don't think it's going to be a memorable event necessarily, but let's just sort of keep an eye on that. Somewhere from Missouri off into the eastern Corn Belt, there could be that mainly 1 to 3 inches. The trends, though, variable temperature trends. Every 3 to 4 days, I think we're going to alternate back and forth, and generally most areas below normal precipitation. So we're getting into, well, we're in usually a pretty busy time. We're going to continue into that as we gradually work into that transition into spring. Speaking of spring, this week I'm going to provide some of my thoughts on what this upcoming spring will bring, so stay tuned. That's my email. I'd like to hear from you. If you like what I'm providing you, if you're a frequent listener to my briefings, send me an email. I'd like to hear what's going on in your area. I always like to keep up to date with what you all are doing. So John at BlueWaterOutlook.com. Have a great week.